On the extinction timeline in 2050, we have the extinction of lists of predictions, apparently. Talk I chaired here with Clay Shirky a few weeks ago. Shirky's done a talk about information overload, and his claim is that we have filter failure rather than information overload. I would perhaps argue it's paradigm failure, but that's a separate issue. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about really is who the book is aimed at. Who do you expect to be reading it, and what might they do with it?
Well, it was sort of written essentially with a sort of business audience in mind, but what sort of ended up, I think, is it's very general. It's a book for absolutely anybody that's curious about the future. And it seems to sort of tick the boxes on that one. I mean, my mum likes it, so, you know, it must be sort of vaguely in the right direction. And I think there is, you know, I've got futurists being extinct by 2050, but there is a tremendous amount of interest in the future at the moment. I mean, if you look at the size of this audience, and I think that is directly related to the level of uncertainty and anxiety that's around, and to some extent the speed of change. Witness last week, for example. And also to some extent, people getting a little bit tired of other methods. And there are huge problems with the profession. I wouldn't usually use that word, but you know, there are a lot of futurists, for example, that are very fond of the fact that, you know, there are aliens amongst us already, and most futurists are actually very, very far out. I tend to be sort of 3 to 5 to 10 years, and occasionally go into 2030 or something like that, years out. So I think that's why there's an interest in the book, and I think it's to some extent satisfying that curiosity, basically.
It's interesting because actually in the section on media you referred to the fact that people's curiosity or concern about the future is perhaps pushing them to adopt more high-quality, high-value publications, which... Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also to some extent generational. I mean, I think there's an anxiety around sort of 40 plus. And the older you get, possibly I don't know, the older you get, maybe the more concerned you are about the future. You know, I don't think the future scares anyone under the age of 10 at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes,
well, you make the nice point that people under 35 have never experienced a recession and have considerably more confidence, perhaps, than people of, you know, another generation, an older generation. Just very briefly, I know you're sort of a bit wary about this question, but you're intimating that there are other forecasting models or forecasters who perhaps you're not enamoured of so much. Is it just because they predict alien invasions, or is there something else wrong in there?
I say, to begin with, I got very uncomfortable with the word futurist. It just smacked of lunatics, basically. But what I quite like about it, if I say I'm a writer or something, it doesn't quite get to what I do. Whereas if you say futurist, it does explain what I do, even if half of the people then instantly walk out of the room. And I'm okay with that. It's sort of, it's better than the other labels, effectively. So I've sort of grown to love it. And it's, you know, it's getting taken quite seriously. There are resident futurists in some very large organizations now. I mean, BT is the obvious one, but sort of IBM, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's about at least 15 to 20 in the US alone. And in terms of sort of other methods, it's not necessarily called futurism or anything, but it's, you know, environmental scanning. Scenario planning is the word futurist would never be applied to anything generally that's to do with scenario planning. They're quite discrete, but they're actually basically the same thing.
Right.
I mean, scenario planning has more rigor to it, that's all.
Okay. And do you endorse scenario planning as a sort of complementary model?
Yes, I'm a monster fan of scenario planning.
Because for people, scenario planning is something that came out of Shell in, I think, the early 70s and was taken up by some renegades in the Global Business Network and others. And
I mean, it's quite, I mean, it's mainstream now. I mean, the Ministry of Defense, the CIA do scenario planning.
And how would you characterize it briefly?
Essentially, what you're trying to do is I mean, it's full of jargon, but it's you know, you're trying to create that axis. So you're looking at sort of drivers of change, and you're trying to get things that are opposing. So economic pessimism versus optimism is quite a good driver. And once you've sort of agreed on that axis, you then develop these worlds that live in those quartiles, and it's quite narrative. It's essentially storytelling, which is why some very large businesses are so incredibly uncomfortable with it, because, you know, they're not used to telling stories about things. And in fact, most large businesses are pretty cynical about the future generally, because it doesn't, in God we trust, the rest bring numbers, and unfortunately the future doesn't have any numbers against it. I mean, you can try putting numbers against it, but they're just projections, and they're of limited value. But so it's quite a good way of ordering the thought and your thinking about the future and creating some kind of framework. And generally what you do is, once you've developed in quite a lot of detail each of those scenario stories, you take your existing strategy and you whack it over the top and you see if there are any gaps. So, for example, a bank does incredibly well in moorism. That's kind of where they are right now. It's like, more and more money, please. They do pretty well in Smart Planet. I mean, Smart Planet is Apple and Siemens, and they're very happy to be there. Enoughism caused businesses a problem, because essentially one of the key thoughts behind enoughism is buy less stuff. So they're not very happy about that. And they're not very happy about Personal Fortress either, because that's deeply localized, deeply suspicious of business and brands. So, and you can start working out, well, we'd have a problem in this area. So if this sort of scenario came to pass, we would have to do this, and so on and so forth.
Okay, very good. I just want to kind of go on to sort of macroeconomic issues, which you don't talk about so much, but you intimated you were interested in talking about. And some of the themes you pick up in the book in sort of economic and business trends are cost-cutting, a move to a more creative economy, which you characterise as a right-brain economy, scale being less important because people can come together in sort of informal units, which is again a Clay Shirky theme and a theme of other people in this in the sort of Web 2.0 world, I guess. Open innovation, the 14-hour work window, the idea that you will have 14 hours a day where you are available for work, even if you're not working all the time. Outsourced innovation, so outsourced beyond the developed world, if you like, and intra-workforce conflict, where having a more multi-generational workforce leads to more, I guess, cultural conflict through to lack of kind of commonality, if you like. I'm interested in how you see those kind of workplace developments affecting how business might plan, or organisations might plan for the future in any of those particular areas. But also, a lot of the things you talk about imply a great increase in productivity. A lot of the services and products and so on that you talk about being, in Gibson-esque terms, here but unevenly distributed. How do you see productivity and technology helping to realise the creation of these things to support these kind of future scenarios?
I mean, there is a massive problem in most Western, if you want to use that word, countries, which is the ageing of the workforce theoretically means it's less productive, and to some extent technology has to sort of take up the slack. I mean, outsourcing can do it up to a point. I mean, work is actually changing quite significantly. I mean, the workforce is becoming much more balanced. There's more women and minorities in the workforce, and I think more women is meaning it's more feminine, actually, which is quite a good thing. We're shifting from a sort of male military command and control culture to a much more sort of empathetic, intuitive style, which is probably quite a good thing. As you say, it's becoming much more open, and if you look at innovation in particular, which is something I'm very interested in, it's, it wasn't so long ago innovation was a sort of department, and how it was run was a bit of a state secret, and even the rest of the company couldn't contribute, let alone suppliers, customers, and so on. And it's now sort of following the open source software model and being opened up and all the rest of it, which is extraordinarily, that's a very, very big shift. Not quite sure what else to say on that.
I mean, I guess it's that, I was interested that you, and a couple of places in the book say, ultimately, I think, and this is to paraphrase you and slightly caricature, technology can save us, which is, a lot of people in contemporary discussion, particularly around sustainability and the environment, and say, technology will not save us, we have to tighten our belts and so on. To what extent do you believe that, technically, human society can be productive enough to create some of the futures that you talk about?
I think the interesting thing about technology is it's not going away. We can't really uninvent it, and it's going to accelerate over time, I would imagine. And it's already causing all sorts of issues. It's getting faster and faster, and we're almost at the level already. I can't really deal with any more emails. And that'll get sorted out to some extent by technology, but the sort of constant connectedness, the fact that all these things are always on, there are social problems falling out of this technology. And I think we've got to be, technology is obviously neutral, but we've got to be very, very careful about how we use it and what we say yes to, really. And yeah, I do actually say that in a lot of instances, I think technology will be a force for good, but I think it's extraordinarily problematic in certain areas.
Yeah, so there was an example you gave of intelligent inboxes. You said Microsoft will probably invent this, and I'm pleased to tell you that Microsoft has invented it, although I haven't seen it in a commercial version of Outlook yet. I was interested in your William Gibson quote because it's actually quite widely cited these days as a meme, to use another meme. And people talk about technology being unevenly distributed, or the future. And I think there's an interesting thing which Gibson doesn't get his head around, which is inventing something and it being widely distributed, being sort of socially instantiated, if you like, are very different things. And actually, it being invented is not the key thing. It's its actual sort of dispersion, if you like. And I wondered how you see, I mean, and I guess this sort of also comes down to your question about when do things disappear, or at least not disappear, but become insignificant. So you talk in the book about, TV disappearing or becoming unimportant, whereas very often one finds that old technologies actually morph into something new. So radio is still very popular, perhaps, through podcasting and DAB and so on, even though it was, supposedly going to be, made redundant by television and so on. So how do you see, through the kind of trends and dynamics that you describe, technologies moving from, invention and the lab to being commercialised?
It's not logical and it's not linear. I mean, yes,
Right.
the quote almost implies that something gets invented in Tokyo and it eventually comes everywhere else. And to some extent that's true. I mean, there are, at the moment there are people, 5 out of the top 10 books, physical books sold in Japan, or the top sellers in Japan last year, started off as these phone novels, which people are downloading and reading on their phones on the way to work. You've got people sort of writing 80,000 word novels now on mobile phone keypads, if you can get your head around that. And, the theory being that eventually reaches here. Well, first of all, a lot of this stuff is culturally specific, so it's not necessarily going to come in that form. Secondly, things get invented and they die. I mean, the model I like most of all is almost a Darwinian model in its evolution. And, the triggers to some extent are accidents or sort of external events. Things adapt, they mutate, some make it, most don't. And just because it's there doesn't mean it's eventually going to come over here at all. And it's very, very difficult to predict. I think you can see, I mean, I suppose my point about this generally is you can't predict individual events. That's completely impossible. But you can see waves building up. You can sort of see patterns. So within wireless technology, it's clearly going to get more ubiquitous and faster. Now, beyond that, it gets difficult. And putting dates against things is really setting yourself up to get your head chopped off. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe to give a specific context, in about a year's time, it will be the 40th anniversary of the creation of the ARPANET, which we know today as the Internet, which, I think there was an announcement today by Gordon Brown that money was going to be given to deprived students to get PCs or, G phones probably now, and get internet connectivity and so on. So the internet connectivity, access to the network, if you like, has become almost a given, if you like, amongst all classes, all strata of society. How would you explain, for instance, why something that started off, in a research labs in American universities and the Department of Defense, became this socially necessary thing?
You have to look at the role of accidents. I mean, most innovation, he says glibly, is driven by an accident in some form or other, or I should say influenced by an accident rather than driven by. I mean, my book was an accident. I didn't have a vision to write this book. It just sort of happened by accident. If you look at SMS, that was not intended to be used like it's, look at the uptake of that now. And that's, I suppose the point there is coming back to the evolutionary model, which is things mutate and things adapt, change circumstances. And it's extraordinarily difficult, therefore, to predict what's going to work and what won't, particularly in research. I mean, I'm a great fan of just doing it and sticking out there and seeing what would work. And in a sense, coming back to your earlier point about open innovation, one of the things that's happened is the model's slightly changed. So in the olden days, 2 years ago, you would invent something, you would research it, you would get it perfect, you would launch it. The model now, particularly in media, but I think it's broader than that, is you invent something, you just, and this is very Virgin actually, or particularly in the olden days, you invent it, you stick it out there, and you see what the reaction is. If the reaction is pretty good, you start polishing it up, and you get it right, and you keep it there. If the reaction is bad, you kill it quickly, and you move on. So it's a bit like you're using your audience to do the editing, whereas previously you did the editing, and then you launched it to the audience. Right,
okay, so whatever the old models were, actually there are new models that are more flexible and I guess lower cost ways of innovating.
Yeah.
I guess a more fundamental question is, a lot of this, all of it comes down to human needs and human desires, if you like. And I wonder what you would characterise as being the kind of key human needs and desires.
When we decided we were going to have five trends for the next 50 years, one of the sort of ideas I had was, what about doing 5 things that won't change over the next 50 years, which was a terribly good idea at the time until I tried starting to write it. And it's sort of, the answer is in there to some extent. I mean, it's the usual stuff to some extent. It's sort of, it's quite human stuff. It's love, it's recognition, respect, security in the sense of, and control, which is we're out of control at the moment. I can't really think what else I'd say, really. There's a hierarchy of needs thing going on there, and there's the sort of, and funny if I don't fundamentally think those have changed very much. I mean, the more the world changes, the more it stays the same. I mean, the media has changed out of recognition in terms of the technology, the delivery channels. It's still about storytelling. Right. Fundamentally, that's what newspapers do, that's what television does. It's storytelling. That hasn't changed. It will, I suspect, probably never will. How it's formatted, packaged, delivered, produced is all changing. But if you really dig down, it's not changed very much.
Yes, so what I'm trying to get at is there are so many potentials which you outline. I mean, I think the book's quite, you know, amazingly journalistic at one level, just in the kind of scope of examples that you give, and kind of one wants to work out how one would filter them. I think the media is an interesting one, partly because it's an area in which I work, but I think you had quite a lot of very substantial points to make about it. So you talk about the importance of quality and physicalization in media, and obviously in the age of the e-reader and the Amazon Kindle, we're thinking the other way.
You reminded me of quite an interesting point there, which is, first of all, I didn't study history, but in my view, the best futurists are historians. Right. And I think history is so useful in terms of looking at the present and certainly the future. And the point that you just reminded me of is cycles. I think cycles, a lot of things happen in cycles, and you know, that's to some extent why the mess last week happened, because people thought cycles had finished. Clearly they hadn't. And I think it's very, very important to think about that in terms of organizations individually, in terms of markets and so on and so forth.
Right, okay. Yes, I guess there's a question about when the cycles
and that's why, you know, we've almost done the digital thing. We're going back to the physical to some extent now.
Yes, well, I was very interested in that, because you talk about the people's desire to do things which are tangible and experiential. I mean, we've seen that with music, for instance, that, you know, music is increasingly becoming free, but people pay to go to gigs and something tangible. You talk about functionality, personalization being important in media, and you talk about the revival of local news because it's in some way kind of personalized. And you also say, and I think this is particularly interesting, that, and I alluded to this earlier, if you make things which are high quality, people will come to them, if you like. And capturing our imagination and telling us stories. I mean, if one of your News Corps clients were here, you know, what would you be saying to them, or, you know, what might you be saying to them within the bounds of your non-disclosure agreement, you know, about the future of print, the kind of things that they might be doing?
Well, I'd say I think there is a slight shift going back, and you know, it's that Marshall McLuhan, I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
The media is the message, and we 10 years ago people were saying that the packaging is irrelevant, and I don't think it ever has been. And also this point of yes, media is it's become very snack-sized. People won't read longer articles generally, but you know, you make a 3-hour great movie, people will watch that. You know, it's not all about 10-second clips on YouTube and so on. So it is back to the quality point, and I think there will almost be a flight to quality quite soon, because I think people are just, you know, fed up with drivel.
Media Guardian did feature a feature on Prospect and Standpoint and The Economist this week about how people were reading these kind of publications.
There's a really interesting debate about whether we're getting more stupid or smarter, and I haven't made my mind up on that one, so I can't work it out.
All right, I'd like to wind up. I guess in the context of the RSA, it'd be interesting to know what kind of advice you give the RSA as an organisation interested in understanding futures, but also how to incorporate that into a sort of broader, you know, not a commercial agenda, but an agenda around creating a better society. From what you understand about how the RSA works, how should it be being savvier and trying to understand the kind of areas
I don't have any clever things to say about that at all. I think what it's doing is great. I would lose live events at your peril. I think moving content online is fantastic. I mean, what I particularly like about the RSA is the diversity. There are too many organisations out there that are quite subject-focused. They're specialists, and this is a very diverse society, and I think that's fantastic. And it's also, you know, as earlier comment, it's aware of its history, which is no bad thing as well.